Finally, in 1947, the British, sick of the thankless task of overseeing Palestine, scheduled transfer of Palestine to control by the fledgling, inexperienced United Nations. The UN resolved that Palestine be partitioned into 2 states, one Zionist, one Arab. Jerusalem was to remain an international zone to be enjoyed by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Partition was to take place on May 15, 1948. Of course, the UN had no right to give Arab property to anyone. Nevertheless, although Jews owned less than 6% of Palestine at that time, the UN voted to give most of Palestine to the Jews. Resolution 181 granted Jews 57% of the land. The Arabs, who had formerly occupied 94% of Palestine, now possessed only 43%. Yet even this colossal land grab did not satisfy the Zionists. They claimed all of Palestine. They resisted the idea of coexistence with a Palestinian state, just as they do today. As a result, 26 days before separate independence was to be declared for both Jews and Arabs, Zionist covert forces began a program of terrorism aimed at driving Arabs out of Palestine. The National Geographic tells us, at 4 o'clock on the morning of April 19, 1948, 132 Jewish terrorists from the Ergin and Stern gang fell upon the peacefully sleeping Arab village of Deir Yassin, west of Jerusalem. For 8 terrible hours, murder occurred until more than 200 men, women, and children lay dead, 15 houses dynamited. The corpses were piled in a nearby quarry and burned, and that pillar of black smoke has darkened the Jerusalem air ever since. Today, a hospital for the mentally ill covers the site. Many think that use appropriate. Ergin leaders like Menachem Begin, who was not present at Deir Yassin, have denied the accusation of atrocity. The deaths were a result of what he considered then and now a legitimate military action. Televangelist Dr. Jerry Falwell, a close friend and supporter of Prime Minister Begin, called Begin a great man of God.
The Deir Yassin massacre is credited with frightening Palestinians out of their ancestral homelands as no other Jewish tactic until that time had been able to do. Begin made it clear that not only were Jewish forces capable of such unthinkable atrocities, but they would repeat them again and again as long as Palestinians resisted. After May 15, 1948 arrived, roving Zionist trucks mounted with loudspeakers blared to the Arabs that if they did not flee immediately, they would be slaughtered. With Deir Yassin vividly in mind, and fearing a bloodbath all the way to the Jordan River, roughly 800,000 Arabs fled in panic. At the same time, now that their British protectors were gone, they appealed to their Arab brethren for help. Yet the Arab forces, poorly armed and ill-prepared, were no match for the aggressive Israeli army, supplied with the latest military hardware by the Soviets. When the war ended, Israel controlled 78% of Palestine. Thus the Arabs, after being promised by the British a national homeland in Palestine if they helped defeat the Turks, and being assured under the Balfour Declaration that Palestinian rights would be respected as equal with the Jews, and being scheduled by the United Nations to have their own independent state on May 15, 1948, the Palestinian Arabs ended up with none of these things. Instead, having lost their farms and businesses to the Israelis, more than 1 million Palestinians were herded into internment camps, where they and their children would learn to hate Israelis, Christians, and the treacherous West for the next 50 years. Following the so-called Jewish War of Independence against the Arabs in 1948, Israel seized, without compensation between 90 and 100% of the Arab and Christian homes and property in cities of Palestine it now controlled. Most owners, which included a high percentage of Christian Palestinians, were forced to find refuge in slums or refugee camps, never allowed to return.
Zionists have been able to seize Arab lands and property in Palestine and drive out their occupants because of the romantic, pseudo-biblical idea that Jews have a God-given right to live in the land, even if disobedient to God. This premise, coupled with intense sympathy for Jewish sufferings, blurs and desensitizes the Christian West to what it really means in human terms to be a Palestinian Arab. It is difficult for us to imagine what it is to lose house, land, and livelihood in order to make possible the Jewish Christian dream of a national homeland for the Jews. What if tanks and bulldozers appeared at the end of your street? What if the bulldozers actually leveled your house? What if you and your family were trucked far away to live for the next 50 years in a ramshackle tent city amid squalid, subhuman conditions, dependent upon charity from the United Nations? If you can imagine such an outrage, maybe then, for the first time, you can actually understand what it feels like to live inside the skin of a Palestinian. For this is exactly what has happened to the Palestinians again and again and again throughout this century. Zionism, peace proposals, partition, all meant one thing: loss of homes, land, and livelihood. If you as an American were huddled in the cold of a refugee camp, and you knew very well that it was Christians who had given the government the moral authority to have your home bulldozed, would you not do everything in your power to oppose Christianity? Physical resistance for you might not seem out of the question. Rather, it might be the only way to hold back the aggression and get the attention of an indifferent world. As a result of their hasty flight from Palestine, roughly 400,000 Palestinian citizens lost their birth certificates. The newly formed State of Israel then upheld that only those who can prove citizenship are entitled to live in Israel. On this pretext alone, 400,000 Palestinians lost all their property to the Zionists and were forbidden to return. Soon after, in 1950, Israel passed its law of return, guaranteeing every Jew worldwide the right to dwell in Palestine. The Palestinians, having lived there for 1,300 years, continued to be denied that right.
By 1967, Arab anger over the plight of the Palestinians had again reached the boiling point. The Arab allies of the Palestinians, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, mobilized on Israel's borders. Yet they were suddenly attacked and defeated by the Israeli Air Force during the Six-Day War. Consequently, the Palestinians found themselves even worse off than before. East Jerusalem, occupied by the Arab Palestinians, was annexed. The Golan Heights were taken from Syria, the Sinai, including Gaza, from Egypt, the west bank of the Jordan River from Jordan.
In a September 1983 article, the Reader's Digest describes how in Israel an Arab population of 800,000 lives under harsh military rule. 50% of their land was confiscated for supposed security reasons. In place of Arab farms, Jewish settlements sprang up. Yet Arabs were restricted in their right to buy land or rent housing. Arab cities in Israel, such as Nazareth, composed of Arab citizens, were largely deprived of funds, services, water, economic aid, and educational opportunities. Writing in 1983, the Reader's Digest commented, "An order last year subjected the Arabs to torture, a system of constant harassment through frequent arbitrary arrests and curfew. Jewish settlers were officially encouraged to carry arms and use them if necessary."
After 1967, Prime Minister Menachem Begin had announced plans to make the West Bank part of Israel. In preparation for this eventuality, the occupied West Bank was crisscrossed with extra-wide highways between Jewish settlements. Avoiding Arab cities, such thoroughfares cut through Arab orchards and farmlands. The hundreds of miles of such asphalt benefited the numerous illegal Jewish settlements, yet blighted the Palestinians. Describing such roads, the Reader's Digest continues. In defiance of international law and numerous UN resolutions, such settlements proliferated in the 1970s as Israel confiscated 65% of Arab land in Palestine. The Fourth Geneva Convention of International Law states that foreign countries may not colonize and build settlements in occupied territory. Yet Israel continues to build settlements throughout Arab lands it does not own. For almost 40 years it has